Morning. Good morning to our in-person audience and to our Zoom audience. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted today to welcome Casey Fitzgerald, a former senior staff member at the St. John's Water Management District. Some of you know me as a paleontology geology hobbyist from my earlier programs.
You gotta maybe pull it back down just a little bit here, and then it lets the mic go forward.
Hello? Okay, are we good now? Better? Better? Okay. Today you'll get to know me from the perspective of my working career in water resources. Long story short, I translated time as an environmental advocate with the Fairfax County League of Women Voters into a career as a non-engineer working for and with environmental engineering firms. Critical to my career, I met and married Arthur Saarinen, an environmental engineer in Florida, in 1979 and moved to Fort Lauderdale, where I became involved as a civic volunteer on those environmental issues. With a few connections, I was ultimately appointed by Governor Martinez to the Florida Environmental Regulation Commission, serving from 1987 to 1991. There, I advocated to protect wetlands, conservation rules from attempts by industry to weaken them, to protect aquifer water quality from leaking underground gasoline storage tanks, and to promote safe water quality standards for reclaimed water. During that time, I enrolled at UF for a master's in water resource economics, in which I made a study of the water withdrawal permitting process at Southwest Florida Water Management District. Ultimately, I sold the business to a national water engineering firm in order to answer increasing family responsibilities. That was after two large projects, one for Southwest Florida Water Management District and the other for the St. John's District. Casey Fitzgerald has been involved in natural resource protection, restoration, and management for over 40 years. He initially served in Tallahassee as the Bureau Chief of State Lands Management in the Florida Department of Natural Resources, and then as the Assistant Director of the Florida Conservation Association. In his subsequent 27 years at the St. John's Water Management District, Casey served primarily as the Assistant Director of the Department of Water Resources overseeing regional ecosystem restoration programs. His final role was as the Director of the district's Springs Protection Initiative. So you can see he's the qualified one for this, for this talk. Casey has held various advisory posts, including the Board of Directors of the Florida Stormwater Association, member of the State of the Florida Pollutant Trading Policy Advisory Committee, trading pollutants, and the chair of the Alachua County Environmental Protection Advisory Committee. In his retirement since December 2020, Casey has been serving as president of the Florida Springs Council and the Gainesville Neighborhood Voices, and on the boards of the Free the Ocklawaha River Coalition, Florida Springs Institute, and Three Rivers Trust. So you can see he's a busy guy. He has a master's in public administration from FAU. I have a bachelor's from that school, and we are both still mind blown about FAU's loss to San Diego State in the NCAA semifinal game. Tragic. But UConn would have blown them out of the water anyway. So, my slide, please. Florida really was a wet and wild frontier. The wild frontier part is a period that developed mostly after the Civil War. You can read about it in historical novels like Patrick Smith's prize-winning A Land Remembered, describing the period 1858 to 1868, and Peter Matheson's Shadow Country trilogy about killing the real-life scoundrel, Mr. Watson. A list of such books is on the table at the back of the room. I have to say, I read Matheson's trilogy and it was absorbing. And this is about real-life people. But let's talk about the wet part. Oops. In 1774, during his time in Florida, William Bartram wrote, quote, "The Swanee River is the cleanest and purest of any river, almost as transparent as the air we breathe. 50 years later, Judge Breckinridge wrote, "Northern Florida is entirely unlike any part of the United States. Its lakes abound in fish, trout, brim, perch, and soft-shell turtle." These days, it's hard to fish for bass. It's hard to find the bass. But to most white people, non-Indigenous people, those wetlands look dark and threatening. Florida was truly a very watery state. Here's Jacksonville, the St. Johns River down here, already south of where it starts. The headwaters are south of Orlando. The Wekiva River, the Ocklawaha, Swanee. What this map shows is where they ultimately developed river transportation, because trying to get a wagon through the wetlands was quite impossible. What this map doesn't show is that this whole system, all the way down to Lake Okeechobee here, was a massive, almost you would call it a marsh, wetlands. And you see these little lakes demonstrated here. This whole system was ultimately supporting the Everglades with freshwater flow, all the way down from Central Florida. In 1824, even before statehood, the State Territorial Council proposed a cross-Florida ship canal. Actual construction was begun in 1935. In 1845, with Florida statehood, Congress granted to the just-born state government 500,000 acres of land for, quote, improvements. In 1850, Congress granted 20 million acres of lands, quote, unfit for cultivation due to swampy and overflowed condition, out of the approximate 36.5 million acres within the state boundaries. In 1881, the state sold 4 million acres to the Philadelphia businessman Hamilton Diston, who proceeded to dig canals in the upper Kissimmee River Basin. That's here. And the Okeechobee region. So he was basically putting canals in this area to drain the land and make it viable for agriculture and also for water transportation. That sort of set the tone for the whole attitude in early Florida of getting rid of excess water. During these early times, the steamboats were the only means of transportation, but they were also a means for the tourists to discover Florida. And I believe this photo is from the Wekiva River. One commentator from that period wrote that the damn fools were shooting anything that moved. In other words, the passengers were just making target practice out of any birds or other animals that they saw, with not, of course, collecting the remains. So even commercial traffic was being run on these rivers through the wetlands. This is a picture of a tourist ship, and it looks like it might even have overnight cabins on it on the Ocklawaha River. Wekiva Springs, if any of you have been to Wekiva Springs State Park, and when we lived in Seminole County, Arthur and I took our kids there frequently. Well, this was an early commercial development. And I rather doubt that they had any wastewater treatment. probably went right into either the spring or the toilet service, and also went into the spring or down into the aquifer through a cesspit. And also, is my understanding, although I couldn't find a photo, that there was some sort of an orange juice facility operating in this area. So getting rid of the excess water became a political tool, shall we say. So in 1901, Governor Jennings recovered some public lands that had been granted to railroads and other corporations. And as I mentioned before, Mary Mann Jennings, his wife, organized an effort to protect the Everglades, even while he was promoting their development. This is an example of a dredge for canals. Looking at the sand, it might have been even the Intercoastal Waterway, which was completed by 1912. In 1904, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward was elected governor on a platform of draining the Everglades. In 1913, drainage canals were dug to drain the excess Lake Okeechobee water to the Atlantic and the Gulf. That was over 142 miles of canals and 2 locks that were constructed. In 1947, President Truman dedicated what was left of the Everglades as a national park. In about 1920, phosphate was discovered west of, or rather east of Tampa and Fort Myers area. And the phosphate mines provided acid drainage to Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay. But at that point, they weren't concerned with water quality. But already Lake Monroe on the St. Johns River was choked with water hyacinths in the early 1900s. Here's Governor Jennings and his family with a press tour of the Everglades Drainage Project of 1907. But Florida was a paradise. That's how it was marketed up north. It was a tourist paradise created and marketed by coastal railroad builders, Plant and Flagler, who built extravagant resort hotels in Tampa, Jacksonville, and this is St. Augustine. Flagler's Hotel Ponce de Leon in St. Augustine. If you've been there, it's still a magnificent building full of Art Nouveau effects, as are other buildings that he had constructed. This is another boat on the Ocklawaha River. And what they're showing here is that, oops, out of control, is that this boat, this is supposed to be nighttime, and they were burning, they had flames up here on this tub to illuminate the nightlife that people could see on the Ocklawaha. From Palm Beach to Miami Beach, Tampa to St. Petersburg, Pensacola to Panama City, developers created resorts from mangrove-covered barrier islands and tidal marshes. From 1900 to 1930, state population increased by 350% to 1.1 million. In 1925, 2.5 million tourists visited via trains, rivers, and roads. And in 1925 and 26, land sale boom created opportunities for fraud and bank failures. The real Florida wasn't paradise. Mosquitoes cause malaria and yellow fever, Cockroaches, spiders, scorpions, snakes, summer heat, hurricanes, oh my. But tourists were undaunted. Incidentally, DDT was not used in the US until after World War II. I was almost born in Fort Lauderdale. My family is from Philadelphia, but Mom decided for some reason, or actually my father thought he had a job in Fort Lauderdale at a radio station, that when he came down to visit when I lived there in the early 80s, we couldn't find it. But Mom decided she couldn't stand the cockroaches. And they got on the train and went back to Philadelphia. There was water pollution, hurricanes, floods, land scams, bank failures, and Florida was in an economic depression before the 1929 market crash because of all the bank failures. It was really a good place for scammers, and it still is. The Great Miami Hurricane of 1926 devastated Miami to Fort Myers, and they hit land in Pensacola. Lake Okeechobee breached its muck dikes and drowned several hundred in the town of Moorhaven. Okeechobee is 700 square miles in surface area. It's the fourth largest lake by surface area in the US, but it's very shallow. Average depth, I think, is 12 feet. In 1928, the Okeechobee hurricane flooded through Palm Beach, and again, Lake Okeechobee breached its dikes. At least 2,500 people drowned. Incredibly, politicians downplayed the storm so as to not affect the booming tourist industry, and no financial aid came from the Hoover administration. The storm flood response, demonstrating a pattern of crisis response rather than proactive policies for anticipated crises. In 1929, the state created the Okeechobee Flood Control District. In 1930, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began building major flood control structures in South Florida, including the 85-mile-long Herbert Hoover dike flanking the lake. In 1947, there were two more hurricanes. In 1948, Congress passed the Flood Control Act, directing the Corps to construct more major projects around Okeechobee. In 1949, the state legislature established the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control District to operate and maintain the projects. And that was sort of the beginning of our current water management district setup. In 1961 and 62, Congress authorized the Southwest Florida Flood Control District in Tampa Bay after another hurricane flood, and work began again on the Cross Florida Barge Canal, and the Ocklawaha Dam was built in the early 60s. Of course, the canal was stopped in 1971 by President Nixon, and it was ultimately deauthorized. In 1962 to 71, the Corps of Engineers channelized the Kissimmee River, changing, and that's what this picture is, channelizing the Kissimmee River. No, it's not. It's building a dike around the lake, actually, excuse me. But this is a shot of the natural Kissimmee River, an very early airborne shot. You can see how it meanders around, and it's just really one big wetland. But it was channelized, changing it from a 103-mile long, 2 miles wide river in places, supporting wildlife and wetlands, to a 30-foot deep, 56-mile long canal emptying into Lake Okeechobee. And here it is, channelizing the Kissimmee. It was also referred to as Canal 38. But suddenly, there's not enough water to go around. There's no statewide regulation on water withdrawals from surface water or aquifers, creating Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons. Water wars increased among industry, municipalities, and the farmers of Tampa Bay area, and that started in the mid-50s. Only in the whole state, only the Southwest Florida Water Management District has any authority at all to regulate water withdrawals. In 1956, UF Law School professors Maloney and Ausness met with the Florida Water Resources Study Commission and started drafting a model water code for Florida. And then there's a severe drought. 1970, 72, hardly any rain. And the legislature quickly, and I think in the dead of night, adopted the modified Maloney Model Water Code, the 1972 Florida Water Resources Act. And that was more in the same vein of crisis response, not anticipating that you're going to have issues, but rather just responding to them after the fact. This stimulated the year of the environment in 1970-72 with the passage of the Model Water Code. Under the leadership of Governor Reuben Askew, the Florida Water Resources Act authorized 5 water management districts aligned with surface watersheds, created permit system for water withdrawals, and the boards were to be appointed by the governor. But the district administrations were not actually formed until 1977 because of financial issues. Under the 1972 law, criteria for water use permits include reasonable and beneficial use based on Western water law and consistent with the public interest, however one defines public interest. The permits must define the amount of water allowed to be withdrawn by the permit holder, but no meters are required on their wells. Many wells north of Orlando were artesian, but they were not required to be capped when they were no longer used. Districts were expected to conduct research and monitoring and to develop minimum flows and levels, which is a key phrase, but there were no deadlines for developing those minimum flows and levels to protect the water resources. Here is a map of the Florida Water Management District surface water basins. So Northwest Florida up here, and the Northwest Florida Water Management District was handicapped from the beginning by a very, powerful legislator who greatly constrained the amount of ad valorem tax rate that the district could use. And the water management districts were funded by having their own ad valorem tax, as you may have noticed on your ad valorem bill from the county. Where I live in Hale Plantation, we are just over the Swanee River line, which is roughly in this area, I-75. The St. Johns River Water Management District is a very large district encompassing, I believe, 18 or 19 counties. The Southwest Florida Water Management District, also very large, with a number of rivers in it. And the Southwest Florida Water Management District, which, as we were mentioning with the previous map, their watershed, surface watershed, goes almost all the way up to Orlando. What's notable to me is that these are boundaries for surface water. So they're still thinking flood. They're still thinking manage those flood waters from the hurricanes. But it doesn't work so well when your primary water resource is an aquifer, because the aquifer has a different watershed with different flows coming from different areas. So it becomes, if now our biggest function for our water management districts is to regulate the withdrawal of water, you end up with conflicts between water management districts because they are issuing permits for withdrawals that might interfere with each other across district boundary lines. And some of those withdrawals are really big. I mean, we're talking multi gallons per day. So how well does this 1972 Water Resources Law work? It all depends on Tallahassee. The Southwest Florida Water Management District has what's called the Southern Water Use Caution Area, the Big Red Hole. And it expanded during the period 1980 to 1990s. The district has been seeking some way to reallocate water while reducing total withdrawals, and ended up using some financial incentives. Some people think it amounts to a market. The overpumping has had severe effects on surface waters, wetlands, and forests, as well as causing saltwater infiltration from the coast and from deep connate or ancient seawater. There's a conflict among users as well as those seeking to protect the natural environment and the sustainability of the resource. Unfortunately, the law refers to what I think of as sustainability of the resource, but rather they talk about you have to protect water for the environment. And the politicians can say, oh, well, it's just the environment. We don't need to worry so much about that. But really, it's resource sustainability for the future. The system fails to address the cumulative effects due to the lack of minimum flows and levels. In 1996, Governor Childs required the districts to submit priority lists for mean flows and levels, but there's still no deadline for acting to limit withdrawals based on those mean flows and levels. Also, the system fails to evoke the scarcity value of water in a way that people normally respond to supply scarcity, i.e., through the market price. And being a water economist, that is my whole focus. And that was my master's thesis, was to look at the Southwest Florida Water Management District Big Red Hole and to think about how we could develop some way of evoking the scarcity value of water. The only place in the United States where there is an effective water market is in Colorado, where the water from the Colorado River basin is actually tunneled through the Rocky Mountains to the eastern slope of the Rockies, where there's only a certain amount of water which is allowed to be taken out of the Colorado River for that purpose. But what is delivered on the east slope is then marketed, bought and sold between the farmers and the cities, the growing municipalities. That's the only effective water market in this country. But there are water markets in other countries like Australia, Chile, and Israel. So now we have increasing water quality problems. Lake Okeechobee was eutrophic due to agricultural and dairy farm drainage, including via the channelized Kissimmee River. Whoops, maybe we made a mistake channelizing the Kissimmee, but then we decided to fix it. So the 2021, which is 30 years, restoration of 40 miles of that natural river and its floodplain cost about $1 billion. So you add together the cost of constructing the canal in the beginning, you caught the cost of the damage, the ecological damage, the cost of cleaning up the Okeechobee pollution, and besides that, the state bought out the dairy farms in the river watershed that were causing the pollution. And those dairy owners then relocated in the Swati River watershed, contributing to springs contamination. A 1983 task force on water issues reported major problems with hazardous contamination of aquifers and surface water from leaking underground storage tanks and landfills. The Water Quality Assurance Act gave DER the authority to protect aquifers and clean up contamination. And also the 1985 Surface Water Improvement and Management Act to improve and protect waters of regional or state significance like Lake Apopka, Lake Okeechobee, Tampa Bay, Biscayne Bay, Indian River Lagoon, and the lower St. John's. But look where we are now. How well did that work? Well, we have red tides, we have dying manatees, starving manatees. What happened with pollution control? In 1989, DER approved near drinking water standards for reclaimed water to be used for residential and agricultural irrigation in an effort to reduce aquifer irrigation withdrawals and safely dispose of treated municipal wastewater. And then we come to undoing the Year of the Environment, because ultimately all of our water protection depends on politics in Tallahassee. And that's my lead in to Mr. Fitzgerald.
Okay. So you like this around the back of the head? Is that how
You need me, yep, over your ears, kind of like backwards
around the back of
glasses.
the head. Okay. All right. Should I take about 20 minutes for this, you think?
Yep, whatever you need, very important.
Okay, so this will be a 3-hour lecture. We have some professors here, I'm sure, that you can just go on and on, right? So I'll set it for 22. How's that? We'll see how we do. So yes, thank you for inviting me to be here. This is a great audience. I love coming out here. I've been here a few times before. This program that Phyllis is involved in organizing is really a wonderful program for you all. And I am going to be talking about the subsequent years. Now, Phyllis got to talk about the first 100 years, give or take, or 100 years worth of stuff. I'm going to talk about 30 years worth. As Phyllis mentioned, I'm currently involved with the Florida Springs Council. You're going to be hearing from Ryan Smart next week on the politics of Tallahassee. He's up there a lot, which is really unfortunate for him. But he's up there right now and throughout this entire session, trying to mainly fend off bad bills that are trying to make their way through the session this year. Florida Springs Institute, Bob Knight was here last go around, or at least zoomed in, I guess. He had a medical issue he was dealing with, but he zoomed in, so you could, if you saw that, you got kind of the background on the Springs issues from him. And the main issue I've been working on, frankly, is freeing the Ocklawaha, which is, as Phyllis mentioned, the beginning of the Cross Florida Barge Canal. They created one reservoir on both ends of the system that was going to go from Palatka to Inglis, and we're still trying to get the dam out here, just south of here, on the Ocklawaha River. So let's move on here to our outline. So I'm going to talk about really Florida hung in there up through about 2010. We were still, Florida was growing like a weed, but still we had the resources and capacities to manage a lot of that. I'll give a statewide view, and then I'm going to use St. John's as a case study since I spent most of my professional career there. It's a good indicator of how things went down, if you will, during the from 1990 to 2020 when I left. There are a few things I can say about DEP and community affairs, and then we'll start talking about the demise of all of the agencies and environmental protections in Florida, which really took a huge acceleration during the Scott administration. And we'll talk about what DeSantis administration is doing and then what really should be done. I would like to mention I've got two of my colleagues here, Bob Bernstein, formerly of St. John's, and Steve Richter, formerly of St. John's. So thanks for coming out. And I think one of your prior speakers, Jim Gross, was also formerly of St. John. So you have a few of us that have come out here to present and or live. So I hope to join you sometime if I can talk my wife into it, but so far haven't been able to do that. Oh, Pat. Well, wonderful. I was going to drop your name later, Pat. So I'm glad you're here. So again, I said we were holding our own in Florida, primarily because of, as mentioned, we had some really good governors back in the day. And Ruben Askew, as was mentioned, really helped quarterback the whole year of the environment, which had tremendous long-term beneficial implications. Then we had Bob Graham, who was a resident here, who was just phenomenal, a real roll-up-your-sleeves kind of guy that really got into protecting the environment. And so he did lay a foundation that lasted for a while. Well, when he was governor, and I was privileged to work with him a little bit, his basic theory was, let's keep our budgeting and staffing commensurate with the growth in Florida. I mean, that makes sense. If you're going to have all this growth, we need to be able to manage it. You need to have funding and resources devoted to doing that. He also took a pretty large step forward for public lands to be managed for the people. Historically, as Phyllis indicated, I mean, basically the lands were sold water cheap, not even dirt cheap, but water cheap back in the day. You could get was $1 an acre or 25 cents an acre for Diston to come down here and please drain this land and build us a railroad or do something. So old Florida was giving it away, and Bob Graham came in, and most of that had stopped due to environmental regulations, but he wanted to reestablish the public trust doctrine and said, make it clear to people that you can't just use public lands as you see fit. And the most telling part of that was the submerged lands in the state of Florida, Eastern Water Law, and actually pretty much all over the country, coming from Europe. The submerged navigable waters within a state belong to the people of the state. And so, whereas historically they'd been dredged and filled as people saw fit, that had been stopped, but still people thought, if I have a 100-unit condominium, I should get dockage for 100 boats. Well, if there were a lot of seagrasses and manatees and other things or navigation issues, no, you can't do that. So what Bob Graham's established the principle that, and we helped implement it via rule, which was really your right to the waterway is no more than your, quote, riparian right. That is to put a canoe in and paddle out into the waterway. That's your fundamental right. But beyond that, you will have to do what is environmentally acceptable, and you're going to have to pay a fee for that. You need to pay back the people of Florida for using their land. So he was kind enough to send me off to sell this to the development community and the marina owners, and we had some pretty lively hearings out there, especially when we wanted to get up to 10% of the gross revenues of a marina. That was one of the proposals. That never did fly, but we started getting significant revenues back from these lands that were public lands back into the public trust, so we could use those for managing those lands. So anyhow, Bob Graham set some really good guidelines and principles that lasted well into the up till 2010, basically. And then Florida's land acquisition program, that was another feature of the 1972 Water Resources Act. And the environmentally endangered lands program was started. Florida had the very best land acquisition program of any state in the country, bar none, for decades. And this is a book that was just put out. It's called Forces of Nature by a fellow by the name of Clay Henderson, who's a former president of Florida Audubon, among many other things. I would really commend this to you. If you want to find out what's really happened to land and the acquisition of it in the state of Florida and protection thereof, it's a really excellent read. And there was another item that kind of flew a little bit under the radar when marine fisheries got a huge boost in Florida by passage of a Save Our Sea Life constitutional amendment. It was more commonly called Ban the Nets. But it got 72% voter approval, and the purpose of that was the environmental community and recreational fishermen saw the commercial industry just over harvesting all kinds of fish, especially bait fish, which is starting to collapse. Frankly, the coastal ecosystem in various areas. And so, frankly, I was with the Conservation Association at that time, and we tried to negotiate. We hired FSU to come in and let's negotiate some solutions. And after a half hour, the commercial guys just walked out and said, over our dead body. So we did a constitutional amendment and got 72% voter approval and basically eliminated most of that inshore netting, no more shrimp trawling inshore, anywhere out to 3 miles on the Atlantic or 9 miles into the Gulf. Really profound benefits for Florida's marine resources. So back to the St. John's case study. So Phyllis showed you where this fit in the big picture. And right now we're here in Gainesville. St. John's headquarters is in Palatka. The St. John's system is actually 310 miles long. It runs all the way out past Jacksonville, past Fernandina. And there are other tributaries, the main one being the Ocklawaha, and its main tributary is Silver Springs. And there are a number of spring systems. The majority of the flow in the St. John's River during the dry season is actually from spring flow. Places like Wekiva and Silver and Blue, Volusia Blue, and others. So anyhow, it's a very large system, and the Indian River Lagoon is the easternmost key feature. And as Phyllis alluded to, the manatees are starving in the Indian River Lagoon now because the seagrasses have pretty much disappeared. And Bob Vernstein could lecture you probably for 3 hours on that anytime you want him to. But anyhow, this is the St. John's system, and so this is what we're going to be talking about today, is in my case study, this area here. So again, back in the day when we were holding our own, the board members, 4 of the 9 board members, when I joined the St. John's Water Management District, were also members of the Nature Conservancy. So that shows you what an environmental perspective they had. Pat Harden was one of those people. And Pat Harden told me to come to St. John's because it was a great place to do really good work. I agreed with her and I did that, and I'm grateful for her advice. When Governor Bush came in, they were business oriented, but they were educatable. It was very much like the classic New England Republican, where they saw, fiscal, were fiscally conservative, but also realized that the environment was worth protecting in and of itself, but also because of the long-term economic benefits of having a good environment. Charlie Crist came in and got us people like Richard Heyman, which is a law professor here at UF in environmental law. He even hosted a climate change conference in 2007 where I got to meet Arnold Schwarzenegger. We brought Arnold in to talk about climate change from California. The downside there was that the legislature did not go along with Mr. Crist's proposal to deal with climate change, and not much came out of that. Again, back to St. John's, our staff resources, and really this applies typically to all the districts, were exceptionally qualified because we could be, well, number one, people love to do the work. Number two, we could compete with the private sector. We did salary surveys every couple of years to make sure we were within striking distance of private sector salaries. And the fact that it was really good work and we had a good benefits package, we could keep really good staff for a long time. And so we had excellent continuity. We had excellent institutional knowledge developed over all those years and could do phenomenal work. Here's an acronym I didn't take out. It's the Surface Water Improvement and Management Plan. That's what that refers to. That was a function of a bill that was passed to address some of the water bodies that most needed attention. And there were 6 of them identified in the original legislation. And St. John's had the St. John's River, Indian River Lagoon, and Lake Apopka. So we had 3 of the 6 in our district. So we got very aggressive, again, turning our highly qualified scientists and engineers. We actually ramped up staffing to do that, to come up with plans. You analyze the situation and then you say, here are the solutions. We would put those solutions into a very detailed plan, and we actually started working on implementing those solutions. So by the end of, we also added additional swim water bodies over time. You were also allowed to do that. So by the end of probably the 1990s, we had included the entire St. Johns River, Lake Apopka, one of the originals, plus the Upper Ocklawaha. And this is actually a misstatement. It wasn't the Christmas bird count, but this is the largest number of inland species at any one site is at Lake Apopka. And that's a function of a restoration project we did where we restored 15,000 acres of former wetlands that was converted into farmland and then back into wetlands. And it's a huge magnet, and there's actually a drive through there that's very popular with birders and whatnot. Indian River Lagoon, northern coastal basins, the St. Augustine area south, and the Orange Creek Basin, which you may not realize that's what you're in, is the Orange Creek Basin. But anyhow, we had water supply, or had swim plans, surface water improvement management plans for all these areas, and it was well into implementing them. And in fact, by 2010, we had water quality trends for the surface water systems were all favorable. We were getting declines on nutrients and algae and all that sort of stuff in all of these systems because of what was invested over this 20 plus years of investigating and then solving the problems. The one thing we had not addressed and had not been addressed by the legislature at any point was springs. And we put that on our agenda in 2010, 2011 to work on springs. And then we'll talk about what happened after that. But the bottom line is our staff and our millage, the tax rate was stable. And frankly, we were the envy of the world. I mean, we would go to conferences, national, international conferences, and they would say, okay, so your legislature created these on hydrologic boundaries, not political boundaries. I mean, that's unique. They're independent. I mean, we had board members like Pat Harden. She was empowered with her colleagues to set how much taxes was going to be charged within the district and how that money was going to be spent. And they did have a lot of independence up through 2010, frankly. And having what constitutionally authorized taxing authority, as Phyllis pointed out, it wasn't until a constitutional amendment was passed in 1977 that authorized this taxing authority to the districts. That's when they finally really got going. So anyhow, again, we go to conferences and people would just be amazed at the capabilities that we had to deal with water resources, and Florida needed that. As she pointed out, it's a water state. We needed to deal with this resource. Other entities, DEP was hanging in there. They never were super strong, but they realized that their stormwater rules that they'd had in place for years were supposed to be capturing 80% of the nutrients going in. Well, it's more like 40. So they came up with a big proposal on how to revamp all that. There was a lot of pushback from industry because that means you have to take more land out of development to treat water. And so, but up into 2010, that was on the way to being done. DCA was still actually able to manage growth to an extent. They had comp planning requirements. They had DRI review processes. So big developments of regional impact had to be reviewed by the state, and the counties and the cities all got involved. And you generally got much better growth management out of that whole process. However, in 2011, Mr. Scott was sworn in as governor, and he had a transition team. And his initial charge to his transition team was, let's eliminate those water management districts. They are just speed bumps on the road to economic growth. So one of the members of the transition team was an environmental lawyer, and he represented big developers, of course, not the environment. But he told Mr. Scott that, well, really, the statute has all these requirements. We won't be able to get consumptive use permits for our development. We won't be able to get our developments permitted if we don't have an agency to issue the permits. So that threw slight, wrench into the works there, so they couldn't eliminate the water management districts. So, but what they did was, this is the outcome from our baseline of 2008, pre-recession. So what things would have gone down a little bit, but at that point in time, we had 700 staff and $400 million budget. The Scott administration mandated at minimum of 25% tax reduction. And some, I think one was as high as maybe 32 or 3 in Southwest, because they had actually bankrolled a lot of funds to do meaningful projects, and they were just viewed as, oh, you're just hoarding money. That's the public's money, give it back to them. So anyway, bottom line is that they reduced tax revenue, they reduced staffing by 25% as well. And so by the time I left, we were down at from 700 to 530 staff, and from 400 million to $137 million. So that is the level of impact that we've had from that. The kind of getting into the weeds on that, we had strategic staff terminations. Most of our senior staff were fired immediately. 2 executive directors were fired. The second one effectively, well, the first one effectively retired because he didn't want to continue to, implement the policies. The second one was fired because he was a little bit too soft on the staff. We did have that mandatory 25% staff reduction. And what that did, so remember, they wanted to make sure the permits still got out the door. So all the permitting stuff was retained, but the scientists, the engineers, the people that were working on solving all these problems, they were the ones that were initially cut and reduced over time. And the consultants, we had numerous consultants. We had to end all those contracts. When they were doing a lot of the work that we didn't have the horsepower to do at the district, we'd hire consultants to help us figure out the problems, come up with the solutions, could do no more of that. My personal experience, I had to help terminate people, and this is right after the recession. So you're sending people for no good reason, you're sending them out into the workforce because we have to reduce staffing. That was a very painful experience. I was personally on at least 1 termination list, and maybe 2. I tried to confirm if I was on more than 1, but I'm not sure how I survived. And then, of course, after going through this process, my immediate boss, who I helped, terminate folks, then once he got done firing people, he was fired because he'd done his work. And he also kind of wanted to follow the law, which was, also a problem. Anyhow, bottom line, at this point in time, I would say that our scientific and engineering capacity is no more than 35 to 40% of what we could do back in the day. And a lot of those people are just, they're not able to do the level of work that we needed to do, and we do not have the capacity to bring in the consultants either to do the work that needs to be done. DEP and DCA, remember that little effort to at least get the stormwater rule redone? That was canceled upon Scott's arrival. So we still have stormwater systems that are being built every day that are about 50% effective to the extent that they should be. And DECA is no longer working to manage growth and make it pay for itself. It has been completely gutted. Comp planning requirements have all but been eliminated. The DRI review process has been eliminated. So it's getting to be a Wild West out there. And of course, the legislation this year is going even further. They're trying to preempt all local government regulations, basically, in the environmental field and many others, which will just turn things loose. There's my 22 minutes. So I'll wrap up. I'll keep going just for a minute. So what's the DeSantis administration doing? Their annual statement, they come out, he did a little press event and said they're doing more and more than ever. They do keep funding the Everglades. He has made a commitment to that. There's been a lot of funding from the Everglades folks to help him keep that promise. But elsewhere, all there is a sprinkling of funding that are for Band-Aid projects and pretty much for a photo op. There are really no meaningful efforts that would make a difference, I'm sorry to say. The best example, when the governor came in, he had an executive order creating a blue-green algae task force. The blue-green algae blooms are problematic all around the state at various times. And so he created a task force. Wendy Graham from UF, for example, was on that. I think Tom Frazier was on that. Also then from UF. They came up with a series of pretty good recommendations. I mean, we looked at them, we suggested making them stronger, but you know, they thought for a first step, this was a good thing to do. Well, since that time, exactly 12% of their recommendations have been implemented. 88% have not. So, what's necessary to actually make a difference in Florida at this point in time? I mean, really, it's you know, it's kind of the stitch in time. It's an ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure. I mean, the fundamental concept is pretty simple. We need new and/or tighter regulations on sources. You got to get back to the sources. You don't want to spend these, like the Everglades. We're going to spend $30 billion or more to clean up the Everglades, quote unquote. It's never going to be close to what it was. If you go back to source control, you can, you know, you don't have the problems to deal with, and it costs 10 times as much to try to fix a problem than it does to solve it up front. So on the quality end, you need to control the pollution sources and loads. On the quantity, you need tighter regulations and or cost incentives. And as Phyllis, if we just would have adopted the recommendations out of your master's project to put a dollar figure on this water, you know, right now the water you get is free. It's free. What you're paying for is the delivery service. What an agricultural person does, they pay $125 for a well, and then they get free water, like up to 20 million gallons a day, free. Does that make sense? Is that going to urge conservation? No, it's not going to encourage conservation. So we need to address that, especially up here in North Florida. The spring flows, as Bob Knight, I'm sure, told you last go around, we have reduced flow reductions, and that creates all kinds of ecological and other problems. My prognosis is that, unfortunately, none of these are likely going to happen during the DeSantis administration, since we are on track to be the freest, you know, state in the country, the freest state of Florida. So I'm sorry, I like to end on a positive note, but that's very difficult to do in this time. So we've used up all of our time, and I guess we can handle a few questions.
Sure, we can handle questions. We've got an eager beaver here at the back of the room.
Thank you, Casey. I thought it was a great talk, and I'm certainly not a fan of the cuts that have been done. But let me ask you, just from the point of view of whether or not the activities that Scott implemented achieved the objectives that he had said. Did he, I mean, he said he didn't want to hinder economic growth. Has economic growth increased, or has that flopped too? In other words, was it in any way at all worthwhile what he decided to do?
I am not an economist. She's more of an economist, so maybe she should start on the economic aspect, and I'll talk about the side effects, perhaps.
The whole 8 years was so painful to me. I basically turned it off. But the important thing is, how does one define economic growth? I mean, they can claim economic growth when, in fact, key economic indicators have gone down. And what indicators do you use? Well, for example, lifespan. Or education. I remember being at a presentation by a big accounting firm that every 5 years would do an evaluation that was paid for by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And every year, the problem with Florida was education and our transportation system. And that was very unattractive to business. Did Governor Scott do anything for those issues? No. But I have a question. Why is the federal and state governments paying billions of dollars to replumb the Everglades when that area is going to be inundated with salt water in the next 50 years or so?
That's a great question. I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but I'll get back to your question of, what were the real outcomes of the Scott administration? I think what you're seeing them right now. You're seeing what the Indian River Lagoon, which was the most diverse estuary in North America / in the world. Bob, you're the expert. North America totally collapsed. Okay. To the point where you have the seagrasses have all died because, again, the algae blooms shade out the seagrass. Hence, all the species that rely on that seagrass, not just manatees, are adversely affected. But you had over 1,000 manatees die in 1 year because they were starving to death. That's one ramification. All the red tides that are happening. Sure, red tide was natural, but UF finally did a study that documented all these nutrients. They're ramping up red tides, significantly. Blue-green algae blooms, same thing. They were a natural phenomenon back in the day, but they were very infrequent. Now they're much more frequent and much more intense. So those are the outcomes. And if you look at even spring flows continue to go down. They have not been stabilized whatsoever, despite legislation that was passed during the Scott administration to deal with that. DEP, the agencies that's supposed to implement that, has done nothing to improve the water quality, and the water management districts, frankly, have nothing to reduce the withdrawals. So the ramifications of the administration, of that administration, are still rippling, and they're all very negative.
Phyllis, let's swing to Zoom.
Okay.
Pat Harden, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Casey and Phyllis. One thing you mentioned about the Everglades, and I've been on a chain mail now for a couple of years regarding the Everglades. And as you said, it is giving the politicians political mileage. The reservoir that they're building, many people feel, is a waste of money because most of the pollution still comes from north of the Everglades, from Central Florida. And so, as you said, the billions of dollars that could have been spent doing other things that would help have instead been used for basically photo ops. And as Phyllis said too, you are going to end up with sea level rise. I brought this up one time at a meeting, and they said, well, if we can get the fresh water back in, the pressure will hold the salt water out. And I didn't comment because how much fresh water are they really going to get back there to begin with? On the other hand, you mentioned Clay Henderson's book, Forces of Nature. And for those at Oak Hammock, I am trying to see if I can get Clay to come and give us a presentation on a book. It is an excellent book on synopsis of land conservation in Florida. And thank you, Casey and Phyllis, for your presentation.
Another thing about all of this is that those drainage canals that were built back in the early 1900s are very effective in draining the nutrients and the sediments from the agricultural areas into our coastal waters. And that's one reason for the hyper nutrification of our coastal waters and the increasing red tides. So, Alice.
I really appreciate this presentation from both of you. I am wondering, since the last several governors are really killing the golden goose, and what can we do to educate people as to what is really going on underneath all of their hype?
Well, I don't know. I mean, for example, small town or small city newspapers are folding, like the Gainesville Sun. We no longer have an effective newspaper here. Oh, what do you do? How do you communicate online? Well, people spend their time on Facebook. People spend their time playing games. Do we still have environmental programs in our high schools? I don't know. So
I have one comment on that. I can put a glimmer of hope out there. And again, the fellow that's coming next week, Ryan Smart, who's head of the executive director of the Florida Springs Council, he's a younger fellow. You'll notice he's probably only 40-ish. But what he has done is targeted the 18 to 35-year-old group. And the way to do that, number one, being younger himself helps, but they've hired someone who's in a master's program here at UF who is studying social media and how to reach those people where they are. You can't get to them, even if you had the op-eds, they don't read op-eds, right? But what they're doing is targeting these folks, and it's amazing the response they're getting. So hopefully Ryan I'll mention to Ryan to talk about that a little bit, because we had over 2 million hits on a piece that we did. 2 million hits. It was a manatee related thing, and so everybody loves manatees. It was clever. It got distributed all around. So there is hope to get to that generation. The generation that is watching Fox News, I'm sorry, I think that's a lost cause. So I'm relying on the younger generation. They are more open still. And so, they're inheriting a bit of a mess. But again, that's a bright spot where we're really reaching people that I think, will be the next generation of decision makers, and hopefully they'll make better decisions.
I happen to be involved in a study that was funded by EPA to estimate the economic value of the Indian River Lagoon. And this was back in the 90s. $3 billion a year of economic value, economic stimulation to the surrounding 5 counties. That's $3 billion a year. You make a sewer out of it, and it's going to have very negative economic impact, I believe. So, Richard.
On this unique day, I'd like to turn to politics, which probably some observations that I've had when I was listening to the history that you both gave, an excellent summary, is that the big movers and shakers were Democrats. Under the current administration, and for the last 2 or 3, when Republicans take over, now this may be due to my bias, like Gainesville, I'm a big D Democrat, but it seems like that there was a clear definition of the parties that did something for the environment, but I could be totally mistaken. It seems like as Florida has become more Republican, we've had more kind of firing and interruptions and budget cuts and declines. But, I'm looking for a bias screen. So I'm trying to see if that makes sense politically or not.
Well, if your whole mantra is about low taxes, that means you don't have the money to support educational or regulatory efforts. Do you have
Phyllis?
a comment about that?
The interesting thing, even back in the day, before my time, the Democrats, even if they were conservative, a lot of them, Lawton Childs is a perfect example. He loved nature. He was out, he loved to hunt, he loved to fish. He at least appreciated nature. And so environmental stuff, they tended to get it. You got to protect this stuff or we're not going to have it anymore. But the classic business person now that may be a Republican, they don't see any of that. They have no connection, and they're just looking at theoretical bottom lines. Less regulation means more profit for my company. And it's a pretty simple equation for them. And they've just, the one fundamental precept of economics that I remember when I had to take one class was this idea of dealing with externalities. If every entity had to deal with the externalities, what costs they would place on others by their activity, if they had to pay for that, then everything would be fine because they would find ways to minimize the impact so as they wouldn't have to pay for said impact. But I don't know what happened to that concept. It's a great theory, but it sure hasn't been put into practice.
Well, it hasn't been recognized politically, but I'll tell you one thing, climate change is one huge externality of the fossil fuel industry. Any other questions? Bob?
A comment and a question. The $3 billion you mentioned for Indian River Lagoon, the value of that, I had calculated that the seagrass itself contributed about $1 billion a year to the regional economy. The interesting part of that is that the call for action came primarily from local chambers of commerce, the business community, which was really interesting. It was the financial stuff. And I'd like Casey's point. I mean, I can poke a hole in the ground with a permit and pump as much water as I want. The water is free. What kind of a system would you have where there's actually incentive to economize on water or to pay for water?
There are various suggestions, including just a flat fee per the quantity of water. But my master's thesis was about exactly that, where you have regions, water use caution areas, where somehow, some way, they need to reduce pumping. Well, because of the political structure of our district water management district boards, it becomes impossible unless unless you focus your allocation to the most politically powerful organizations. And that's basically what is going on now. Municipalities are being squeezed because governmental agencies are less politically or lack political power. But I suggested basically to the Southwest Florida Water Management District that they look at some kind of auction program. And there are economic computer labs where different parties can interact through the computer system to simulate a marketplace. And I thought that could be developed and programmed. And interestingly, at the time, and this was like 1995 or so, the Water Management District thought they'd give it a try and they'd do a prototype. Well, they were sued by Pinellas County, which said they had no, and the administrative judge said they had no legislative authority to do that. So what I understand now, what developed ultimately from that is that the Southwest Florida Water Management District devised a system within their permitting structure where new permit applications the water use permit is only for a specific time period, and you have to come back in and get that permit renewed after 7 years or 20 years. And when you do that, if there is another application in this water use caution area, there apparently is a little monetary exchange between the two permit applicants to kind of even things out. Now, I haven't got any confirmation on that. I just read that in one report. I don't know. Oh, yep, money works. Money is grease. To consultants, political consultants in this case, lawyers, yeah.
But I mean, to your question, Bob, it seems like there ought to be a way to come up with an economic scheme, a financial scheme where you find out where the push point is, or where it's going to be to the point where they're going to think about doing a more conservative approach. And
Yeah, we're going to end up in a crisis response situation with our water supply. That's
yeah,
what it's coming down to.
exactly.
So,
Tragedy of the commons. Yep.
so
Phyllis, we have time for one more question from
Oh.
Zoom.
one more question.
Holly, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for the presentation, although for a Floridian that was born in Pinellas County and has been all those places you talked about, it was rather depressing. But the gentleman's name that's going to present next week, my thought is those of us in our age group seem to think we have all the answers to everything, and we're always asking, what can we do? I think what should be done, an example, I'm looking forward to next week after Casey made that comment about the student that's ahead of, I don't remember the group anyway, but encouraging young people. And, we have, not we in Gainesville's representative, but we have a rather amazing young man that I've been spending some time trying to not only support, but to call and engage the office staff in Washington, and Maxwell Frost from the Orlando area. And the other one, although he's seen that generation, and although he's seen now as somebody that is supporting certainly the angst over our weapons issues in this country, but David Hogg, both of which have a audience of the networks and people in news journalists, and they have a message and know how to organize the young people. And I just think your presentation should be in every high school in the state. And I'm wondering if it couldn't be made available or marketed. But I just think it's incredibly important to focus on that generation that's coming up. And as you said, Phyllis, certainly the climate change is a big issue, but this is based in that in some sense too. So I just, it's very worrisome. And why at this point in time we are not charging for water is just beyond me, other than that big P politics. But thank you again for your presentation. The pictures were great. It reminds me of some of the places I went with my parents growing up.
Thank you, Holly. I have one closing remark, if you don't mind sitting here for another 5 minutes. About 30 years ago, an attorney at the St. John's District expressed to me that the environmental movement in Florida had been led from the beginning by women. The beginning of that list would include Mary Mann Jennings, who organized women's groups in support of protection of the Everglades in 1901, 1902, even as her husband, Governor Jennings, promoted draining the Everglades. Must have made for interesting dinnertime conversations. We are familiar with the name Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, of course, and her book, River of Grass. As a young journalist, she moved to Miami in 1915, and until she died at age 108 in 1998, she was a close observer and powerful opponent of getting rid of excess water. Another woman who you may have heard of is Marjorie Harris Carr, the wife of the UF Marine Fisheries professor Archie Carr. Marjorie, critically important in North Florida's water resource protection movement, founded Florida Defenders of the Environment. She spent decades successfully fighting the Cross Florida Barge Canal and for the restoration of the Ocklawaha River. But there's another woman who many of you know personally, Oak Hammock resident Pat Harden. Pat has been a lifelong dedicated advocate for Florida's environmental and ecological protection. She has served on many boards where she influenced state policy, including 8 years on the St. John's Water Management District Board, and was for over 30 years on the board of the Florida Nature Conservancy. In 1989, Pat was instrumental in achieving an unprecedented legislative protection for the Wekiva River and its watershed. The spring-fed Wekiva flows through northern Orlando suburbs of Seminole County into Lake County and Seminole State Forest on its way to the St. Johns River downstream of Lake Monroe. It's a federally designated wild and scenic river and an outstanding Florida water that nevertheless, in 1983, 1985, was threatened with high-density development on its banks. Pat was the leader of a small group of us as Friends of the Wekiva who worked to develop and pass the Wekiva River Protection Act, saving that beautiful river. We caught the development industry off guard, and they will never again let the legislature pass another law like it. So thank you, Pat Hard, and thank you, Alice Gridley, for your work in Boca, where Alice was a leader of an environmental movement. Thank you all so much for coming, both the Zoom audience and the in-person audience. And thank you so much to Casey.